Welcome to CUNY Laureates, the show about CUNY graduates who went on to win major awards in their respective fields. On this episode, we profile another 3 Pulitzer Prize winners who graduated from the City University of New York. We learn how Liu Hongxing used his knowledge of long-form photography to capture the essence of historical change. Then, we hear how Bernard Malamud rewrote his life story from one of poverty and struggle into one of a celebrated writer. Finally, we discover how A.M. Rosenthal climbed to the top of the New York Times masthead and steered the paper through one of the most important legal challenges in U.S. history. If you had to capture one's life in photographs, how many would you need to take? Or would you rather choose to take one perfect photograph that captures the essence of one's life? This is a story of a CUNY graduate who became a Pulitzer Prize winner and his lifelong effort to capture historical change, one photograph at a time.
That evening, I would stroll by the Tiananmen Square, and I said to myself, this is a picture I would love to take them studying, some of them with a bicycle. At the distance, there is this Mao's mausoleum. So I decided this depth of field is critical. It was so dark, no indication from the light meter. So I just take a wild guess, close the lens aperture down completely, press the B shutter, and I would count to 23 seconds. 22, 23, I was holding my breath that long, I could no longer do it anymore. I released the shutter. It was the longest exposure of my career. I like the photograph because it, studying for exam has a history in every country. But in China in particular, it's ingrained in every parent's head, in every student's head.
Liu Hongxing was born in Hong Kong in 1951 to a prominent family from Fuzhou, a city located in southeastern China. It was Liu's mother's desire to give her son what was at the time considered a proper primary education that led the family back to Fuzhou a few years later. Liu soon learned that in Mao's China, being part of a prominent family wasn't necessarily an advantage.
It was the only school report card that there is an item that says political behavior. My family's background kind of preordained how much, what score I would get. I would never get past a C.
But there was an important lesson to be learned from these experiences.
The political message would be drilled into everyone, from the school kids to the adult, into their consciousness of what is politically right, what is politically wrong.
On top of that, this political and moral certainty came in a very unique visual form.
These posters, these murals, it becomes part and parcel with every mainlander's Chinese daily lives.
It was Mao's infamous Great Leap Forward campaign that pushed Liu's family out of mainland China and back to Hong Kong, where his father started working as a newspaper editor in charge of international news reporting.
Suddenly, I started learning English. My father would say, well, here's the story of Reuters and AP. You can translate. So that's already in the 60s, my exposures to headlines and news content.
Surprisingly, his desire to pursue a formal education in the field of journalism wasn't met with enthusiasm.
Oh, no. Don't do that. Journalism cannot be taught.
Liu's second choice, political science, led him to apply to universities outside of China, and it was in 1969 that he learned he was accepted to Hunter College.
2 things happened to me at Hunter. One was his elective course with John Milley.
Known for his pioneering use of lights and long exposure photography, John Milley was one of the first people who managed to capture movement in a single frame, a technique so masterfully expressed in his photographs of famous artists such as Pablo Picasso and Henri Matisse.
In the history of photography, to photograph an artist within one exposure from a portrait of him to what he could do, that was sensational. He said, well, in photography, you have ASA, the film speed, and you have the shutter speed. These three things together make photography unique.
After seeing some of his classwork, Milley invited Liu to become his assistant at Life magazine.
And John Milley would have a lot of newspaper and magazine clipping. His wall is full of this. At that point, he might have already planted this idea of what makes a good photograph. He said you could read it instead of look at it. If you have long sequences of photographs, you can read a much bigger story. Through long-form photojournalism, you can actually tell something that a single image was unable to tell.
In 1976, Liu was sent to his first official assignment in China, the great helmsman's funeral at Tiananmen Square. His trip to Beijing, however, got delayed and he never reached his destination.
That would turn out to be the blessing. I was wandering around on the banks of the Pearl River Delta. That's why I could photograph these people doing Tai Chi, but wearing that black armband. And I realized there was no mourning in their face. They looked chill. And that's what I realized, my childhood images come back. They used to be much more uptight than this. So is China about to change?
For the next 10 years, working as a photographer for major houses such as Time magazine and Associated Press, Liu, now commonly known as HS, would document this change one photograph at a time.
When you look at these photographs that people are adopting to changes, if these changes further translate into a larger trend, what would these changes imply? And then I heard the news, the Chinese students were on hunger strike.
The 3,000 student hunger strikers remain at the core of the protest.
In 1989, while covering protests in Seoul, South Korea, HS was called back to Beijing. Something big was brewing at Tiananmen Square.
Initially, it was all very harmless. All these organizations would have their staff go out and banners and protests and so on and so forth. And then in the middle of the night, the students of the Central Fine Arts Academy will be rolling out this styrofoam statue. I said China would not let an American symbol, goddess of democracy, in China's most public square, the world's largest square, facing down Mao, for too long.
Tasked with wiring photos to AP's headquarters in New York, HS was instrumental in smuggling out the famous Tank Man photo out of China. Yet, Tank Man was not the only photograph that was wired out of Beijing.
HS, the tanks are on the way to you. I got to the rooftop and I look at it, the top of the tank with two PLA soldiers with a helmet. And underneath that bridge, there was this young lovers on a bicycle. And I make a frame, again rush back to the bureau. I put the frame into the transmitter and I send. And the next day, president of the Associated Press sent us an old-fashioned cable. Today, the AP owns the world.
But it was HS's work at the AP bureau in Moscow that eventually won him a Pulitzer Prize, and one very particular photograph that he took on December 25th, 1991.
And then I pick up the phone and say, hey, Tom Johnson here. What are you doing tomorrow? And I said, well, not every day. Chairman of CNN will call me and ask me if I would be free the next day. So I showed up and I went up to this very ornate room. And then I learned that Gorbachev was going to go live, to resign through live broadcast. And I look around, there was not a single photographer. Soviet, TASS, none. Except me. As I sat down, I said, oh my God, this is the place, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviet Union, all of these things gonna end in front of me. Maybe I have a way to capture the speech in the air, still moving, while this event is still happening towards the end. But the history hasn't ended. And then again, the shutter, John Milley telling us about the shutter. The voice of Gorbachev was tailing off. So I pick up my camera and then click. I get out and the flag of the Soviet Union was coming down, and Russian Federation flag was going up. And when I saw Gorbachev was shot on the negative, and I saw the paper was blurry, it was a moment in one's life.
Liu Hongsheng and his team at the Associated Press won the Pulitzer Prize in Spot News Photography in 1992. Yet H.S.'s work is far from over.
And today, I wanted to see what China's 2.0 or China 3.0 look like. From the days when people were clothed in this drab Maoist blue-green jacket to today to be the leading trading partner of 140 countries. So I thought maybe again my camera could capture the layers of complexity, like looking at an onion, to peel it back layer by layer.
Bernard Malamud has been called one of the essential Jewish American writers of the 20th century, renowned for his stories of everyday people trying to find meaning in life's struggles. But like the many drafts he was known for before finishing a story, Bernard's life was also a labored, sometimes torturous process to get where he wanted to go. This is the story of a CUNY graduate who became a Pulitzer Prize winner and the difficult starts and restarts that he overcame to become a celebrated author. It's the 1920s in Flatbush, Brooklyn. On a Sunday afternoon, an adolescent Bernard Malamud is sitting in his family's apartment above their humble grocery store on Gravesend Avenue. The Malamuds can afford little in the way of comforts. There are no books at home or much intellectual stimulation of any kind. Bernard's only exposure to culture as a child is a piano being played by an unseen neighbor heard through his living room window. He listens wistfully, longing for a life outside his poor Brooklyn enclave. Bernard's early life was characterized by struggle and tragedy. His parents were among the million Jewish refugees who fled anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe and settled in New York City at the turn of the 20th century. His father, Max, had to work in their store for 16 hours every day to support the family, including weekends. His mother, Bertha, suffered from mental illness, and her condition deteriorated throughout Bernard's childhood. One day, at the age of 13, Bernard returned home to find his mother lying on the kitchen floor after drinking a can of disinfectant in an apparent suicide attempt. Bertha was subsequently hospitalized and died 2 years later, on Mother's Day, 1929. Bernard's family would never tell him the cause of death. Now a teenager with no mother, and with a father stuck in their grocery store nearly every waking hour, he felt ill-prepared to embark on adulthood. It fostered in Bernard a deep desire to prove himself, but also a gnawing fear that he could not. Perhaps to compensate for this insecurity, Bernard enjoyed being the center of attention in his social life. He was a gifted storyteller, often retelling the plots of silent movies to his friends or making up narratives of his own. At Erasmus Hall High School in Flatbush, this craving for an audience crystallized into a serious pursuit of writing, and he composed an essay about his upbringing, Life from Behind a Counter, which went on to win second place in the 1932 Scholastic Awards contest. His mind was made up. He needed to become a writer. That same year, Bernard was accepted to the prestigious City College, making the long commute from Brooklyn each day. Here he received some crucial guidance from a writing professor, Theodore Goodman. Goodman taught Bernard to avoid what he called dishonesty in writing, those contrivances and superficial narratives designed more to satisfy a writer's ego than to connect with a reader. Either you're going honest or you sink, Goodman would say. Bernard was shaken by this warning. A self-described romantic, he felt that the criticism applied to much of his own storytelling. But Goodman also praised 2 short stories Bernard had written at City College. It was a much-needed validation for the young writer, and it helped him with his resolve to push forward. Bernard graduated from City College in 1936 and began the slow, labored process to develop his writing career. For 5 years, he worked on a novel named The Light Sleeper, but the autobiographical narrative proved to be too tied to his own ego, too dishonest, in the words of his City College professor, and was rejected by every publisher he sent it to. The book was never released, and Bernard eventually burned the manuscript in his backyard. Now married with 2 children and a steady job teaching freshman composition at Oregon State University, Bernard had succeeded in having some short stories published, but still no novel. So he decided to go in a different direction, to experiment with characters and settings unfamiliar to him. The Natural, about a baseball prodigy struggling to restart his career after being shot, contained little of the autobiographical elements of Bernard's earlier writing, but perhaps coincidentally, it did mirror his life in one respect: the attempt to find success after losing years of hard work. It was an attempt that worked for Bernard. The Natural was published in 1952, with a highly successful film adaptation arriving 30 years later. For his subsequent writing, which included 2 more novels and a number of short stories, Bernard would frequently return to the familiar Jewish settings and characters of his humble upbringing. But he would also imbue some of these tales with fantasy elements and dreamlike scenarios. The result was a style unto itself, a kind of fable for the everyman. And across these fables, Bernard consistently returned to a common theme: a moral awakening arising out of tribulation. It was a theme that would reach its apotheosis in his 4th novel, The Fixer. Taking place in the twilight years of Tsarist Russia, The Fixer is about a desperately poor Jew named Yakov, who moves against all advice from a small shtetl to the city of Kiev in search of a better livelihood. Shortly after his arrival, however, a young boy is found murdered near his place of work, and Yakov finds himself the victim of blood libel, the anti-Semitic accusation of ritual murder used by Christians to attack Jews for centuries. For The Fixer, Bernard wanted to tackle larger social and political forces, in this case, the anti-Semitism and revolutionary movements of early 20th century Europe. The Fixer also seems to embody Bernard's own complex views of misfortune and ambition. Yakov, after years of accepting his life of poverty, finally pushes himself to leave his shtetl and achieve something bigger, only to end up in a far worse situation than the one he had left. And yet, in the process, Yakov's plight manages to rattle Russian society and galvanize resistance to injustice. By leaving his shtetl, and by maintaining the will to live and defend his innocence, Yakov becomes one of the engines of history. It's an ambition that fails him, but one that moves the world. In 1967, Bernard Malamud won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, as well as a National Book Award for his novel, The Fixer. Notorious for his seemingly endless drafts to meticulously craft what he called the human sentence, Bernard Malamud, after years of misfortune, yearning, and self-doubt, had similarly crafted himself into a writer. Irving Howe, another CUNY laureate from City College, once called Bernard Malamud the most enigmatic, even mysterious of American Jewish writers. Perhaps owing to his earlier insecurities, Bernard resisted the critics' attempts to label him, to describe him as only a Jewish writer, or to read too much into the autobiographical elements of his stories. One thing we can be sure of is that Bernard Malamud, the child of an unfortunate and isolated household in Brooklyn, wanted very much to be heard. Perhaps the best thing we can do then is just listen. The Vietnam War. Hundreds of thousands of U.S. soldiers had been sent to an unruly, faraway place, many of them to die. The newspapers of the day did their duty covering the war, but was the American public fully informed? This is a story of a CUNY graduate who became a Pulitzer Prize winner, who, as editor-in-chief of the New York Times, oversaw publication of the Pentagon Papers, a choice that ultimately helped secure freedom of the press in the United States for decades to come. In 1969, Abraham Michael Rosenthal was installed as the executive editor of the New York Times. Rosenthal had climbed the editorial hierarchy at the Times, rising from a campus reporter in 1943 to the top position more than 20 years later. The Vietnam War was raging, and the country was filled with war protesters spurred on by pictures, articles, and television footage of dead American soldiers, scorched villages, and innocent Vietnamese civilians being traumatized by the war. It was against this backdrop that the Times was gifted a trove of classified documents called the Report of the Office of the Secretary of Defense Vietnam Task Force. These were secret documents that the Defense Secretary of the time, Robert McNamara, had commissioned to outline the long history of the Vietnam conflict. An advisor to McNamara, Daniel Ellsberg, who had grown deeply disillusioned with the war effort, leaked the documents to Times Vietnam correspondent Neil Sheehan. As editor-in-chief, Rosenthal set up a small team in a New York Hilton Midtown hotel room to read through these documents, and he was astounded by what he saw. In 1986, he recounted,
"When this pile of documents came to us, and we understood after a while what it was, we were looking at the secret political war, political actions, and diplomatic actions of the United States."
The Pentagon Papers, as they came to be called, detailed blunders, missteps, and the expansion of the war that the U.S. government had not shared with Americans. The revelations would be a serious blow to the administrations that had overseen the conflict. Rosenthal brought it to the attention of the Times publisher, Arthur Sulzberger, and at first, the Times law firm advised against publishing. But in-house lawyer James Goodale prevailed by insisting on the First Amendment right, that the press had the freedom to print material about the government in the service of the people. On June 13, 1971, the first of 3 installments was published. President Nixon immediately went to war against the Times.
Times said, "There's 3 statements that we're up against them. It's Henry Sage's conspiracy about, what do you think? It's absolutely clear. Look at they put that money in. You don't see it. It's a vicious war. Right? Sure, we're all against it. Goddamn. And if they're going to go to this way, we're going to fight everything we got. We just takes the chance."
The Department of Justice, under Nixon's directive, issued a temporary restraining order against further publication. But the Times and the Washington Post fought back in a case called New York Times v. U.S. Government that went to the Supreme Court. The court ruled 6-3 that the Times and other outlets, in the interests of public awareness, could continue to publish these papers. A.M. Rosenthal was a decisive force in the decision to publish the Pentagon Papers. It remains one of the most significant court cases in U.S. law related to freedom of the press, cementing the press's ability to expose governments. But Rosenthal rose to the pinnacle of U.S. journalism from a most humble beginning. Abraham Michael Rosenthal was born in 1922 in Sault Ste. Marie, Canada, the son of a Russian immigrant. In his early years, his father, a house painter, snuck across the U.S. border, eventually settling in the Bronx. Abraham had osteomyelitis in his legs that forced him to drop out of high school and become a charity case in a Minnesota hospital where he eventually healed. Eager to pursue a degree, Rosenthal enrolled for free at City College. Soon after, he began to write for the student paper, The Campus. He later recounted, "City College is important to generations of New Yorkers. It gave us a chance to grasp what we could never otherwise attain, life work that fulfilled our desires and capacities. The tuition then was free, which was only a little more than I could afford." A few years later, while still at City College, he landed a $12 a week job in 1943 as a campus stringer for the New York Times. He switched to night classes to finish his degree in 1949. After covering campuses for the paper, he was asked to be a foreign correspondent. He was first assigned to New Delhi and reported all around the region, including Tibet. These early assignments embedded in Rosenthal a firm belief in freedom that would later inform his Pentagon Papers decision. Afterwards, he covered the United Nations, Japan, and Poland. In Poland, as foreign correspondent for the Times, he wrote about the communist regime and its leader, Władysław Gomulka, in such terms that he was expelled from the country after 2 years. The Polish government said in his expulsion order, "You have written very deeply and in detail about the internal situation, party, and leadership matters. The Polish government cannot tolerate such probing reporting." In 1960, A.M. Rosenthal won the Pulitzer Prize for his international reporting. The committee cited those sentences when Rosenthal was awarded the prize. In 1963, he moved on to an editorial role. He earned a reputation for being a hard-nosed editor with high expectations. Some felt him intimidating and unfair, but many of his supporters felt his expectations were necessary for a paper like the New York Times.
The Times is like a house. You can add a room or add a little floor or a little section, but it's got a foundation. We will have a group of men and women that will have a shared idea of what the Times ought to be. Otherwise, it'll be a different paper every day.
Over the next 23 years, he overhauled the Times for a new era. The paper on newsstands and the internet today would not exist in its current form without his oversight.
We are one of the last, or maybe the last, large news gathering paper in the world. But we really want to print our own news. We have people all over the world. I don't think there's a foreign staff like the Times. I don't think there's a national staff like it.
He introduced multiple sections, Metro, Business, and innovated the Sunday paper with new sections and initiatives. He also initiated a national edition. Advertising boomed, and the paper, once on shaky financial footing, prospered. After he was forced to retire at the mandatory age of 65, he became a columnist for the Times, writing on topics ranging from the Middle East, international affairs, and national politics. But it might be his elevation of the standards of journalism that Rosenthal will be most remembered for. "Keep the paper straight" is written on his gravestone, and his epitaph speaks to his editorial rule to stay as neutral as possible in writing and reporting. And although he may have butted heads with staff over the years, he was called brilliant, but also abrasive. The Times remains one of the most respected newspapers, in no small part due to his influence.
I know if the Times ever were to cease, God forbid, you could not recreate it, because now it's built around a lifetime. So a lot of people, reporters, art critics, editors, people come from all over, and they become part of the Times. And if this time disappeared, this whole treasury of people also disappeared. You couldn't find these people again.